I'm Michael Dobson, Professor Michael Dobson, to give me my professional title. I'm the director of the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon and delighted to be speaking here in Craiova. I first came to the Craiova Shakespeare Festival in 2010 when the festival consisted entirely of productions of Hamlet, and it was the first time there had been an academic university performance studies seminar alongside the festival. And I told Emil Borragina, the great founder of the festival then, just before I left, that I would definitely come back every single time this festival happened. And until I was no longer fit to do so, of course, or indeed dead. I'm very pleased to say that I'm not yet dead, that I'm still capable of standing a Wizz Air flight to Craiova, and that I've kept my promise and intend to go on keeping it because I love this festival. I've had wonderful times seeing amazing juxtapositions of productions and experiences here, and I'm really pleased to have this other place that I come back to as though it were a recurring dream, as though Craiova is this special place of Shakespearean activity, and I sometimes wonder whether it really exists in the 2-year gaps between festivals. And during the 4-year gap, since 2018, since the last time the festival happened in person, I've often lain awake at night worrying that it might never happen again. Well, here it is again, changed, developed, and here is the city again, also changed and developed. And it's fascinating to see the ways in which they've in some ways converged, the way in which the festival has been embraced by the city over the time I've known it, and the city has been embraced by the festival. What's happening in 2022 is that while it's still difficult for Asian theatre companies to travel, while it's still difficult for some large North American companies to travel, there's a slightly reduced geographical range to where performances are coming from that we're seeing in Craiova. But the density of the festival has increased because there's so many more local groups and groups from Eastern Europe elsewhere than Romania performing in new spaces all over the city. So there's a tremendous thickness of activity. Everywhere you go on another street corner, there'll be somebody connected with the festival doing ballet inspired by Shakespeare, or Shakespearean music, or jazz recitals inspired by Shakespeare. It reminds me of my early experiences as a student of going to the first big performance festival I ever went to, which was the Edinburgh Festival. Except in Edinburgh, one always gets a strong sense that most of the locals have got out of town for the duration of the festival, and they've rented out their apartments in the city to visitors, that the city doesn't really like the festival, that it's when the city gets crowded and noisy and there are mime artists on every street corner and traffic queues, and they'd really sort of rather keep it at arm's length, in a slightly puritanical spirit. It's not like that in Craiova, where people sitting outside restaurants are absolutely delighted to be overhearing some quite loud music that a ballet company are doing Romeo and Juliet to. Or that's my impression. In any case, and certainly, I've never had seminars in another city where we were in the county prefecture building. Having a Shakespeare seminar in the pre-First World War architecture of the government buildings in the centre of Craiova is an extraordinary experience. That sense that culture is part of the economic and political and community life of the city seems to me very strong in Craiova, which has this huge concrete theatre, bigger, I think, than the National Theatre for the whole of Britain. And that theatre was put in what was the marketplace, right next to what was the law courts, but is now the university, as though culture is recognised as having equal weight, equal significance to economics and to politics, and to play with and around and for both of them. I've seen some extraordinary shows this time, as I've come almost to expect here. Obviously, I work in Stratford-upon-Avon. My usual diet of Shakespeare, when there isn't a pandemic preventing live performances from happening, is rather text-heavy, very faithful, English productions, English language productions, which move at a certain pace and which don't feel able to take certain creative steps, which are worried about the audience of school children who are going to have to answer exam questions about these texts and often want to say the same things over and over again about those texts so that the same exam questions can be set again, even if they're done in different costumes and with different casts and in some attempt at a different spirit. Shakespeare sounds old in English if you aren't very, very good, and that puts a lot of people off, and it restricts that burden of, oh, am I good enough? Am I clever enough? Can I understand all the words? Will I mispronounce something? Can I get through this long, complicated sentence with a lot of these and thous in it? Can really hinder some productions and hinder some audiences. I'm always happy in Craiova that nearly everything I see is in translation, that the language has been made as modern, as colloquial, as ceremonial as that particular company needed it to be, and as a particular audience somewhere needed it to be. It's true that one of the highlights of this festival has been seeing Flute Theatre performing for the first time their 2-hour version of Pericles in English, which is an exquisite thing, with only 6 actors taking all of the roles, speaking the lines as though they were just written yesterday. I cried pretty much throughout that play. I often do. I mean, I find Pericles a very moving, artificially simple and yet strangely profound play anyway, but seeing Flute do it yesterday, I felt pretty drained, literally, just because I've been crying so much. It's so touching a play about what one can get back when one has lost things, and part of one's emotional response to it, I think, is knowing that in life we don't get those things back, usually, not the way Pericles does, and in any case, can you compensate somebody for having been separated from the 2 people he loves most for all that time? You know, that's not going to come back. It's a very extraordinary piece, beautifully acted, no gimmickry. And when I say no gimmickry, I don't mean it was puritanical or original practices. It wasn't trying to simulate the way they think Jacobeans would have played that play, and it had nice lighting. But what it had, all the music was live. Mainly it was people singing, a mandolin, some percussion, a few scarves. It did not depend on amplified pre-recorded music, huge pieces of stage machinery going up and down. There were 2 lines of chairs in an open space. They could have performed that production on a pavement, and it would have had just as much power, I think. So a big contrast to go from that to Oskar Kursanawosz's Othello from his OKT Lithuanian company in the evening in the immense main auditorium of the Marin Cerescu National Theatre, which was huge and extraordinarily skillful and highly wrought and highly rehearsed, and absolutely fascinating in what it did with the play and what it didn't do with the play. It was loud. I mean, Cassio played a Fender Stratocaster while performing the acrobatic trick, as all the cast did, of traversing the stage for much of the time, walking on a huge industrial spool, the kind of thing you find that's had cables rolled around it and that you can pick up for nothing at building sites in some large industrial cities, which I assume is what they did. It's a highly expressionistic, big machine of a production, tremendously highly rehearsed acrobatic skills and athletic skills from the actors. A lot of the play comes to be about the deformations of muscle-bound men, of soldiers who want to be winners and vanquish. There's a lot of macho being satirized in this production. It's extremely funny in a rather cruel way. It's the only production of Othello I've ever seen in which the play is completely stolen by Roderigo, who becomes this sort of rather touchingly heroic and performative big loser of the play, and who sort of wins by continually taking centre stage to do another frenzied, partly ad-libbed routine about what an awful time he's having because he's such a loser in the army. He gets everything wrong at great length. It's also a production that's absolutely fascinating in what it does in terms of the relations between Europe and America, in that around the edges of this Lithuanian translation, very cut Lithuanian translation of Shakespeare's Othello, they keep going into interpolated passages in American English that talk about American popular culture, American cinema, that bandy the names of Denzel Washington and Eminem and Michael Jackson and other figures from American racial politics. And at the centre of this production, or rather pushed to one side of the centre of this production by Rodrigo for the most part, a rather beautiful young coloured woman playing Othello, whose relationship with a very young-looking Desdemona, a Desdemona who played the fact that she was still rather uncertain in the world by performing being a bit wobbly when crossing the stage on spools. This relationship became the only tender thing between women in this production. I mean, Othello wasn't addressed as though the character were a woman, but there was no attempt to conceal the gender of the actress. So it's a fascinating and perplexing way of putting the play sort of at askew to itself and sort of at askew to European culture, which in this production is being rather pried open and disrupted by American Hollywood ad-libbing, which I found both fascinating and disconcerting. It's not a production that made me cry. It wasn't aiming at pathos. The actors, and indeed the characters, were, if anything, rather disenfranchised by the huge scale of these large metaphorical stage pictures and stage machines they were inhabiting, running each other over with these great big spools for death scenes. An extraordinary and, it seemed to me, rather tacky scene of the consummation of Othello and Desdemona's marriage, where the two actresses, the one playing Desdemona, the one playing Othello, were draped in a thin sheet of plastic of the kind used when you're protecting your furniture while painting the ceiling, under which they took off the top halves of their clothing and then sort of cavorted rather beautifully in a rather soft porn sort of way, backlit, with this plastic sheet hanging clingingly onto different parts of their bodies. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't enjoyable, but it was perhaps not the kind of enjoyment that we should be encouraged to indulge in. In any case, as I suggested earlier, it was at least a moment of tenderness in a play that was otherwise all about male aggression, endless, sometimes comic, sometimes brutal, sometimes awful, with a wonderfully funny interpolated sequence of Montano on Cyprus trying to discipline his soldiers and trying to make them strong, which a process which really didn't happen for him at all. But I suppose the big event of the festival, or at least of this half of the festival, this end of the festival, since we're still not very far into it, was the opening performance of Robert Lepage doing his one-man but an awful lot of technicians show, number 887, all about his, or we assume his, there's a lot of autobiographical material in it, an account of his attempt to learn a poem to recite at an event in Quebec, and all the memories brought up by the process of trying and failing to learn this poem. It's a huge feat of memory, this show, about amnesia. For the first time for me, I mean, I hadn't seen this show before. I know Lepage has been working on different variations of it for maybe 5 years now. The earlier work of his I've seen, I found rather meretricious. It just seemed to be one man playing with various technological tricks and, borrowing from famous plays as a pretext for doing so. I thought his show Elsinore, which I saw in London years ago, about 25 years ago now, it was like something that Pink Floyd roadies might put together when bored, if they happen to have read Hamlet. 887 thematized its technical trickery rather beautifully. He had a huge doll's house representing the apartment block in which he grew up. And that sense of the past as having turned into toys, and early 60s period toys at that, with little radio-controlled cars playing the role of his father's taxi at crucial points in the action. The past as somewhere you could think your way back into as though you were a god playing with it as toys, was just fascinating and really spoke to the content of this play. It was all about what it means to be a French speaker in a country that is still officially and still dominantly Anglophone, and what it meant to be disenfranchised, to be perhaps reluctantly caught up in the civil rights struggle of French speakers that became quite violent at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. A very touching performance. There was a lot of pathos in it, as well as extraordinary technical control, both of the voice and of the equipment. And the curtain call, when all the technicians who'd been operating all these toys and devices and projections and recordings and so on came on stage, it was something of a revelation. Calling it a one-man show, as I thoughtlessly did, is really very, very misleading with a show like that. I'm delighted he got all his equipment here and was able to perform it. It was not Shakespeare. Fair enough, he mentioned Shakespeare at least twice. He mentioned Milton, and that's good enough for me when the show is that good. And he was given the festival prize afterwards in recognition of all the work he's done based on Shakespeare in the past. Elsewhere in the festival, I have seen the Bulandra Tempest show, Fortuna, which I think its finer points were rather lost on those in the audience who don't speak Romanian. This was a performance with, I think, only 3 or at most 4 actors on stage, performing a sort of pop opera abbreviated version of The Tempest, amplified. There wasn't much movement in it, except movement from one microphone to another or in front of one camera another, because there was a lot of use of projections onto back screen. In some ways, it was a bit like Robert Lepage Light, done for children's television. And the actors just put on new wigs or new hats to indicate when, and a different special effect on the microphone to indicate which character they were. It was a kind of what I would regard as a late period Victorian burlesque. The dialogue was in rhyme, it was popular music, rather monotonous popular music, most of it 12-bar done to drum machines, and it was sort of a kind of skit, like student comedy version, deliberately prosaic and vernacular comic version of The Tempest. I'm told by my Romanian-speaking friends that the versification was extremely witty, that the content of the script was highly elusive and dense and fascinating and funny and wry in a number of very intelligent ways. The English translation, which those of us reliant on the surtitles got, at least managed to produce something that was in rhyme. But it was fairly inane rhyme. There wasn't much to keep the mind alive while the drum machines thudded on. So yeah, there was it was well-meaning. There was a good-heartedness about it, but what with all the changing of wigs and pulling funny faces at the camera to a drum machine, there was and very bright colours. There was a faint air of children's television about it, which for me didn't hold it for its whole duration. Otherwise, I've heard fragments of music here and there. Because I'm a trustee of Flute Theatre, I spent a lot more time with them, perhaps than I should have done seeing other things. But then one of the things about Flute is that they not only produced Pericles, a 2-hour Shakespearean text version of the whole play for a festival audience, but immediately afterwards they performed their simplified drama games for autistic people version of the story of Pericles for an audience of autistic people from orphanages and their carers, which they performed in Romanian. I have watched them learn the scripts they need to play these games in 5 different languages now. They never cease to astonish and move me. Playing, showing these people how to imitate and join in and be greeted and feel welcome and relax and settle into games which start by looking like a kind of behaviour, but which become play. And when they are playing and they are conscious that they're being watched and applauded, which turn into performance with the actors, it's the most demanding work I've ever seen actors do. Keeping someone whose neurodiversity means that their attention can be intense but compromised and difficult, and that their behaviour in social situations may verge on panic unless they're handled really attentively to everything they're doing. It demands a kind of focus, and at the same time a kind of willingness to just play the way children play make-believe games at the most basic level of theatre that never ceases to move and impress me. So I was with them when they were doing that, and I was with them changing the set, and I was with them later on relaxing over a late meal, which prevented me from going to see The Midsummer Night's Dream from Turda, which was on down in the Nicolae Romanescu Park, which I would very much like to have seen, and I hope other people are going to tell me about, because I'm immensely curious about it. Today I'm hoping to see Shakespeare's Phantoms in the Botanical Gardens. I don't know what they are. I've never been to the Botanical Gardens, though I've seen lovely pictures of them. I am confident that I will be extremely happy with whatever apparitions manifest themselves.